Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in into another one of these Corona for Cinema 4D tutorials. This one will be all about the resume render functionality, and so without further ado, let's just jump straight into it. First off, let's talk about what the resume render functionality actually is. So this functionality enables you to stop your renders in the VFB while they're being rendered. And then it enables you to resume those renders later on. Now it gives you two options on how to resume your renders, and those are by either continuing rendering the existing image that is currently in the VFB, or if you've turned off Cinema 4D or deleted the image in the VFB, to resume rendering from a previously saved CXR file. So essentially, it enables you to stop your renders before they're finished, and then it gives you the ability to continue rendering them at a later point in time. Alright, now let's take a minute or two to kind of go over how it all actually works. Now we won't go into too many details here, and instead we're going to be taking a look at the technical aspects from a bit of a generalized and simplified point of view. That said, it's still very useful knowledge because it will give you a more thorough understanding of the things you can do with it. Great. So the resume render essentially works by taking your existing image, no matter how noisy it is, and then it takes that new resumed image, if you will, and adds it on top of the previous image. Another way to think of this process is to think about it from a standpoint of how a progressive render works. So basically, with each rendering pass, you get less noise. And those passes are being added on top of each other because each pass samples a pixel differently. Ultimately, after a bunch of passes, values will average out and you will wind up getting your noise-free, well-sampled image. And so the resume render functionality, if we simplify it, kind of works like that too. So once you resume your renders, it'll just keep adding more and more passes and ultimately converging into the final noise-free image. Now, that obviously works fine and is intended as long as your scene stays the same. Because if, for example, you stop the render, move some stuff around in the scene, and then resume the render, you'll essentially be getting a bit of a ghosting effect like what you currently see before you. Now that ghosting effect is typically going to go away after enough passes are processed, so there is no residual pixel information left from the previous image. And now, as you can imagine, that is pretty much like starting the render from scratch. So it's a bit of a pointless thing to resume the render, perhaps, and it's better to just start from scratch at that point. Especially so if you consider that something as trivial as moving a plant around in your scene can cause a visibly different lighting scenario altogether. Now, all of this is being mentioned just so you have a better idea of the things you can do with this functionality. Well, okay, with all that said, let's now jump into Cinema 4D and demonstrate how you use the resume render functionality. Alright, so as you can see, we have a render running here and it's doing great, but it obviously isn't that far along just yet. It's still very noisy. Now, let's stop the render the way we would normally stop it, by hitting the stop or cancel button right here. Right, so we stopped the render now, and so all the system resources are now pretty much freed up. Great. Now let's resume this render from exactly where we left off, and to do that, we just simply need to click and hold on the render button here, and select the resume last button from the drop-down menu over here. Give it a minute to load up the scene again, and you'll see it's going to prepare the scene data, it's going to parse the geometry, calculate the displacement, it's going to do all that it needs to do, and before you know it, it'll be back up and running. And as you can see, that is pretty much all there is to it. The render is now resuming, and we'll continue exactly where we left off. Awesome stuff, right? Yeah. Now, that's how you resume your render if you still have it open in the VFB. Now, imagine if we erase the image here by clicking on this erase button. Or imagine that we've closed Cinema 4D down entirely. Well, in that case, the resume render from file option comes seriously in handy. Before we can use it though, we do need to save out the current state of the VFB in the CXR format. And we do that by clicking and holding on the Save button here and selecting Save as CXR. So let me just quickly save this file. And now I can either close Cinema 4D down, or just not to waste too much of our time here, I'll just clear the VFB here. And so in either case, the image we've been rendering is now gone in the VFB. Well then, to resume rendering from a file now, we just need to go under the render drop-down menu here again by clicking and holding on the render button and selecting resume file. Now all we need to do is locate the file and open it through this dialog here that popped up. And that is literally it. The render will resume rendering and you get to keep your sanity in check and your clients happy. Now, you're probably asking yourself, why do we need to save it to the CXR format? Well, the CXR format is a Corona-specific EXR-like file format that contains some extra data in there besides just a 32-bit linear image. Things like denoising data and some other metadata stuff. A quick tip here, you can always use the Corona image editor to open up CXR files, and essentially that enables you to do the whole VFB and light mix magic on them. More about CXR will be talked about in another tutorial though. Alright, at this point what we need to talk about are the rendering targets. So basically, how pass limitations, noise limitations, and time limitations work when you resume your renders. Okay, so let's talk about pass targets first. Pass targets add up onto your existing completed passes, and that's crucial to understand. So that basically means if you start your render with a pass limitation set to 100 passes, and you then stop that render at a completed pass number of 20, and then later you resume that same render with the same 100 pass target, you'll wind up with 120 passes on completion. So again, pass targets add up onto your existing completed passes. Alright, so now let's jump into Cinema 4D and sort of demonstrate what we've just talked about. In front of us, as you can see, we've started a render of our bathroom scene here, and if you take a look at the stats on the right here in the VFB, you can see that we have a pass limit of 100 and we've currently completed 5 passes. Now, if I open up the Corona render settings, you can see that that's most definitely the case. We have our pass limit set to 100 passes. Right. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this render by going under the stop and cancel sort of a drop down here. I'm going to hit cancel just because I don't want the denoiser to come up, because that it's obviously going to take some time to denoise the image, and I don't want to deal with that right now. But what's important for us to know and to remember right now is that we've completed 8 passes out of 100. Okay, and so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to resume our last render and give Corona some time, to parse the geometry and do all that magic. And before you know it, it should be up and running. We're already computing secondary GI here. And there you go. As you can see, we're now resuming the rendering process. Now, we've continued right where we left off with the pass amount here. And as you can see, we still have our target of 100 passes. But if you take a look at the lower left corner of the VFB, you can see that we have a bit of a different statistical output here, right? So let's talk a little bit about that. So this number on the right here, this 108, well, this basically shows you the render target that you've set in the Corona render settings. And then it adds up the number of completed passes to this number. So because we've resumed rendering with a pass limit of 100, and because before we've resumed rendering, we've completed 8 passes, now the total amount of rendered passes is going to be 108. And why is that? Well, that is because pass targets or pass limits add up onto your existing completed passes. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, let's talk a little bit about the rest of these statistics here. So why is this number not matching this number? Well, this number right here, this 100, is just your new render target. So if, for example, better yet, let me stop this render. And don't forget, we had 100 passes set here. If I drop down the pass limit to 10, and now I resume this render, what you're going to be able to see when the render resumes rendering, essentially, you're going to be able to see that now our new rendering target is going to be set to 10, right? And even though we've already completed 19 passes so far in this image, which is this number here, which is the total number of completed passes before and after we've resumed rendering, well, this is our new render target. And to see where we're actually at right now in terms of how many passes we got left, we need to pay attention to this number here, because as you can see now, this number changed because we've completed 20 something passes or so, if I remember correctly. Then we've added plus 10 of these to the already completed number. And this is where we are at, okay? So this is how the passes add up. And just for this left number here, this is actually the total status of the passes completed on this image before and after resuming rendering, plus the current pass being worked on. So there's going to be one pass difference between this number, which is the total number of completed passes, and this one, which also features this pass that is currently being rendered on. Right, and now as you'll be able to see, we've actually completed 29 of the 29 passes. So basically, all the previous passes that we did, plus these 10 passes equals to 29 passes. And now we're sort of finishing up this render here. All right, so just to recap everything, this number right here shows you your currently set render limit. And this number here shows you the total passes completed before and after resuming a render. Now, this number down here tells you the amount of passes completed before and after resuming, plus the current pass that's being worked on in the VFB right now. And the number next to it, this one, tells you the total amount of passes completed before and after resuming a render, plus your currently set render limit. So in a way, when you're trying to figure out how many passes you're going to be rendering with your current render settings after you've resumed the render, these numbers in the lower left corner of the VFB are probably going to be the most important ones to you. Okay, well that covers the pass limits / pass targets. Now, the exact same process happens with setting a time target. So basically, if you have a render that will render for 1 minute and you stop it after 30 seconds, and later you resume that same render with the same target settings, it will ultimately be rendering for 1 minute and 30 seconds. So, bottom line, for the two render completion parameters we've just discussed, this needs to be taken into the account when you're resuming your renders. So if you know you need to complete 100 passes to get to a noise-free image, and you've stopped the render at pass 50, for example, then you'll need to go into the render settings and set the new pass target to be 50, because that will total to 100 passes once you resume your render. So that's the logic here. And the same goes for the time target, where if you have an initial target of 1 minute, which is your overall goal too, right? And you've stopped the render after 30 seconds, then you'd need to adjust the value in the render settings to 30 seconds, because those first 30 seconds before you've paused the render and these newly 30 seconds you've set after you've resumed the render will total to a 1 minute render. Now, as for the noise target and how it works differently. And the way that it works differently is in a way that it will stay consistent throughout. So no matter if you resume the render or not, until Corona figures out the noise target still hasn't been reached, then it will continue rendering until it is reached. And it doesn't matter if you're resuming the render or not. Corona is taking the image in front of it and it's calculating the noise percentage, and until it is reached, the render will keep going, and you can pause it, resume it, it'll just keep going until it reaches that particular noise target. Now, one thing to remember about the noise target and how the noise level gets calculated is that the noise level itself gets updated once every 5 passes. So in our case here, you'll see that we don't even have our first sort of noise level update, because we started this render from scratch and we're only at pass number 3. So we're going to have to wait until we reach pass number 5, because at that point, this statistic is going to get its first update. So let's wait for it. There we go. And as you can see, now we have our noise level being reported here as it previously wasn't. And the next update to this number will come in once Corona renders another 5 passes. So that's going to be at pass number 10 in this case. And so it's just something to keep in mind as you resume your renders, because it'll typically need 5 passes as a minimum to start updating the noise levels in the image. So let's wait for another 2 passes. We just need one more pass, and you're going to see that once we reach 10 here, this noise level is going to update. There we go. And as you can see, that's exactly how it behaves. So again, what this basically means is that once you resume your renders, you'll need to wait for those 5 passes to get the updated noise level statistics. All right, and now for another tip, and this one is pretty big. I use it in production more often than I'd like to admit. So let's pay attention to the render here. We had a render running and it stopped, and as you can see, it reached a noise level target of 20%. So it's kind of below that, but its target has been reached and the render finished. But we're obviously not happy with the noise amount. So obviously the value of 20% is absurd, really. You should probably aim for something much lower than this, but just to illustrate my point here a little bit better and faster, I've used this absurd number. So bottom line, I'm not happy with the result. The render has stopped finished, or better yet, I'm sorry, it stopped rendering. So what can we do? Well, we can go in our render settings again and set our noise level limit to something a bit more realistic or better. And I'm going to set it to 3%. And now what we can simply do is just resume our rendering. And now, as you're going to see, the noise level target is going to change, and it's going to say, yeah, you see, it's going to say 3%, and this is the new noise level target. And the render is going to keep going from where it left off, and it's just going to try and hit that 3% target. So essentially, if you've made a mistake and now your image is a lot more noisier than it would have been, or better yet, it's more noisier than you would have liked it to be, well, now you can just, set the new parameters in terms of how noisy you want it to be, and then just continue rendering off, and the renderer is going to try and hit those new parameters. So this is pretty important. Like I said, it's a very useful production feature. Now, as far as the denoising resumed renders goes, it works just like it would on a normal render. So as with a not resumed render, you will need at least 2 complete passes before it can denoise your image. Now, obviously, the more passes you give it, the better, because the denoiser is processing some of the 3D info of the scene as well, and not just the 2D image you see. That said, typically you'll want at least sort of like 10 passes for that optimal result, but that's broadly speaking. A really cool thing about denoising and resumed renders, though, is that if you had it enabled in the original render like we had here, well, all that denoising info is stored in the VFB, or well, in the CXR file if you are resuming rendering from a file, that is. So when you resume your renders, you're also keeping that denoising info intact. And so all those passes that the denoiser has used before, all that denoising data that it accumulated, it's still there. And it will get updated with extra denoising from the resumed render once you stop it and let it denoise again, right? Now, what is even more useful is that you can enable denoising for the resumed render even though you originally, for the original render, had it disabled. Like I had here with my render that I just started, as you can see the denoise mode is set to none, so the denoisers are disabled. And this is really great functionality here. So basically, in case you've forgotten to enable denoising and you've already started the rendering process a while ago, you can easily stop it, go under the render settings, enable the denoiser, so Corona high quality, and then go back and resume your render. And after at least 2 passes, 2 fully completed passes, the denoiser will work. So let's give it some time here to prepare the geo, compute the secondary GI, do all that magic. And then what we'll also have to do is we're going to have to wait for it to complete at least 2 passes. So we started with 4, so let's wait till it reaches 6. And again, that's the bare minimum amount of passes you need. Typically, It's great if you have at least 10 passes to work with, but this will do. All right, so we've reached 6 passes, and now I'm going to hit stop. It's going to denoise the image, and the denoising will now obviously work. Now, again, obviously the most optimal way is to have denoising enabled from the start, but it obviously isn't necessarily a necessity. And this functionality can really help you out, because if you've started rendering something out and you realized you forgot to enable your denoiser, well, now you can just stop your render, go under the render settings, enable the denoiser, and then resume your render. And it works with CXR files as well, obviously. All right, now we've really covered a lot here, but there's still just a little bit more that we want to show you. We're in Cinema 4D here, obviously, and if I bring up the picture viewer, Cinema 4D's picture viewer, you're going to see that we have this Corona menu here. And if I click on the button here, you can see that this drop-down menu pops up, right? And so we've got the ability to bring up our post-processing effects right in the picture viewer. And then we also have the option, or better yet, the shortcut to bring up the Corona VFB. But what is really important for us in this tutorial are these 3 entries up here, these 3 buttons, right? So resume last, resume from CXR, and dump to CXR. So these buttons here, if I bring up the Corona VFB here for a second, these buttons are all the same that you can, well, basically they're all the same to the ones that you have in the VFB. So let's go through these one by one. So the first button here, the resume last button, well, this one is identical to the resume last button here in the VFB, okay? And the resume from CXR button is identical to the resume file button in the VFB. And as you've probably guessed it, dump to EXR, well, it will basically save this image as a CXR, which is essentially the same functionality as going under save here, clicking and holding and selecting the save CXR button. Now, obviously, we always strongly encourage you to work with the Corona VFB because it is straightforward and it has all this great functionality and options right here at your disposal. But if for some reason you are in a situation where you can only use the picture viewer, well then I'm happy to let you know that you have all of these resume and save options available to you from the picture viewer as well. Now, some of you are probably having that eureka moment right now, where you know exactly when you'll be using this functionality, but for others who are a bit more unsure, well, there are a lot of different scenarios as to when this functionality can come in handy. One of those scenarios might be when you need to temporarily stop your workstation from rendering in order to free up system resources to work on other stuff. So say, for example, your RAM and your CPUs are completely tied up to the current render you're trying to deliver, but at the same time, you need to edit some really high-res footage, and that kind of needs to be done as a priority. Well, in that case, you can stop your renders from being rendered with the peace of mind that your current progress will be saved and you will be able to continue rendering right where you left off. We all know how stressful deadlines can be, right? And that is just one scenario. Another might be, for example, if you are a freelancer working from more of a rural area and there is a pretty huge thunderstorm coming, and you know you're probably going to get some power shortages. And that happens more often than we'd like to admit, especially if you are working from home. And a UPS is probably not going to take you over the finish line on its own unless your UPS is a power plant or something. Well, in that case, you can save the progress of your current render to a file and continue rendering it out later. Right, and as you can imagine, there are a ton of other scenarios where this functionality can come in handy. Maybe the client is unsure whether something needs to be changed or not, but you've already been rendering the image for a couple of hours. Well, with this functionality, you can just simply save it, pause the rendering process, work on other stuff, and wait for the client to come back to you without unnecessarily spending electricity rendering or starting rendering from scratch again. So yeah, quite a lot of creative use cases for this one. And as you've probably guessed, we are at the end of our pretty thorough tutorial here. And I hope you've learned a lot here and that the resume render functionality will come in handy for you. Until next time, take care.